Thank you for joining us tonight. None of my success would have been possible without my wife, Inaya. Tonight, I have a special gift for you, one you've long deserved. Play it.
I'm not leaving him yet. I'll wait until he's truly rich. Then I'll take everything and vanish.
Stop it! Idris, don't do this! Everything you have because I stood beside you through the hard years!
Do you remember the $40,000 surgery, Inaya? You never once asked where that money came from. You won. I stopped playing this game a long time ago.
Inaya's face drains white, lips pressed thin, both hands pressed to her chest, as if trying to hold together whatever dignity is left. Idris turns, walks straight through 400 fixed stairs, heading for the exit without a single glance back. But the woman he just humiliated isn't done chasing him tonight.
It's not over.
Idris Harlan was 38 years old, and for most of his adult life, he believed one simple thing. If a man works hard enough and stays honest enough, life eventually pays him back in kind. He had built that belief the way he built everything else, one long shift at a time, one job site at a time, one paycheck folded quietly into savings nobody else knew existed. He didn't know, climbing the porch steps of his home in Bronzeville that evening, that the paperwork to end his marriage had already been drawn up 8 months earlier, signed, sitting in a lawyer's office, waiting only for Inaya to give the word to file it with the court. He didn't know that the man standing in his living room, the one he'd once introduced to his own grandmother as like a little brother, had been quietly pulling money out of an account that still carried Idris's name. $58,000, moved in small pieces over 14 months so nothing would ever look like enough to notice. What Idris did know in that first frozen second was this. His wife, Inaya, stood in front of the hallway mirror in the wine-red silk dress she only wore for nights that mattered. And Jet Langston, his own assistant at Harlan Development Group, had a hand resting easy on her waist, the kind of easy that only comes from practice. Before we get into what happens next, and how one careless voice memo, recorded almost 2 years earlier and forgotten in a cloud backup, is about to undo everything Inaya believes she's already won, you should know something about this story. It isn't really about a man getting revenge. It's about a man who had already quietly built the ground beneath his own 2 feet, long before anyone thought to test whether it would hold. It had been a 14-hour day. Idris spent it on a mixed-use site in the Loop, the kind of job that starts before sunrise and doesn't let a man sit down until the concrete trucks are gone and the last permit inspector has signed off. He could have handed oversight of that site to a foreman years ago. He owned enough of the company by then that nobody would have blinked. But Idris had never once managed to make himself stop showing up in person. His hands still carried the gray dust of it. His t-shirt still smelled faintly of diesel and rebar oil. He'd driven home the long way, down Michigan Avenue and then west, past the barber shop on 47th Street, where he'd gotten his first real haircut at 9 years old, past the church on King Drive, where he and Inaya had been married 10 Junes ago, back when neither of them had 2 nickels to rub together, and it hadn't mattered one bit. The porch light was on when he pulled into the driveway. That wasn't unusual. Inaya often left it burning, waiting up for him the way she had in the early years, back when their whole life together fit inside a 1-bedroom apartment and a used Honda with a check engine light that never once turned off. He remembered those years fondly, even the hard parts. Maybe especially the hard parts. A man doesn't forget the years that built him. He pushed open the front door, expecting the smell of her cooking, or the low hum of whatever true crime show she liked to leave on for company. Instead, he found the hallway mirror lit gold under the chandelier, and Inaya standing in front of it in that dress, adjusting an earring with the calm concentration of a woman getting ready for a night she'd planned for weeks. Jet stood beside her, not near her, beside her, the way a man stands next to something he has already decided belongs to him. Inaya turned first. Her eyes moved over Idris slowly, from his dust-streaked work boots up to his tired face, the way a person studies a piece of furniture they've already agreed to give away. Idris? Her voice was even, almost bored, the way you'd correct a child for the third time in one afternoon.
You're really something, standing there like that. Stay home tonight. Don't embarrass me in front of the board.
Jet said nothing. He didn't need to. His hand on her waist said enough for both of them. Idris stood in the doorway a moment longer, still holding his work bag, still carrying the smell of the job site on his skin. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask a single question. Something in him had already gone quiet and still, the way water goes still right before it turns to ice. He thought briefly of a wooden chair sitting out in the garage, one he'd built with his own 2 hands 4 years back, when Inaya told him not to waste money on furniture, because we're still poor, Idris. He thought about how he was likely to spend tonight sitting in that very chair, alone, after being asked to leave his own front door.
He didn't argue. He nodded once, small and slow, turned, and walked back out through the door he'd just come through minutes earlier. It clicked shut behind him. A small sound, almost nothing at all. But it echoed through him like something far larger. Somewhere down the block, a dog barked twice and went quiet. The porch light stayed on, burning gold over an empty step, lighting up a home that no longer had a place for him inside it. Idris stood alone in his own driveway, in the neighborhood he'd grown up in a marriage he'd spent a decade building brick by brick. And for the first time in years, he had absolutely no idea what came next. What Inaya didn't know, standing in front of that mirror admiring her own reflection, is that the quiet man she'd just dismissed from his own house was about to make one phone call that would change everything neither of them could yet see coming. Stay with this story, because in the next few minutes, Idris Harlan is going to find out exactly how long his wife had been planning this, and just how badly she had underestimated him. Idris didn't go to a hotel. He didn't call a friend to crash with. He drove north along DuSable Lakeshore Drive with no destination in mind, then doubled back and pulled into an empty lot near the Chicago River, not far from the Lake Street Bridge, and sat there with the engine off for almost 2 hours. The city moved around him the way it always did. Barges eased down the river below. The elevated train rattled somewhere behind him on its way toward the loop. None of it touched him. He sat with both hands on the wheel and let the cold settle into the car. And somewhere in that stillness, for the first time all night, he started thinking clearly. He opened his phone, more out of habit than purpose, and scrolled back through an old banking app he hadn't touched in months. That's when he found it. A secondary account, opened years ago under both their names. One he'd genuinely forgotten still existed. Over the past 14 months, more than $58,000 had moved out of it in small, careful transfers. The recipient, every single time, was Jet Langston. The feeling that settled into Idris's chest wasn't anger. Not yet. It was colder than that. A slow, spreading understanding that he'd been quietly robbed, one transfer at a time, by 2 people who had eaten dinner at his table more times than he could count. He kept scrolling. An old voice memo surfaced next, one Inaya had recorded and sent to her mother almost 2 years earlier, through the same family cloud backup Idris's own phone still synced to automatically. The account they'd set up together years ago to share photos of holidays and cookouts, back before either of them thought to guard it. The message was short
and it landed like a closed fist. Idris is finally building something real. Once it's big enough, I'm leaving. I can't spend my whole life with a man who only knows how to work. 2 years. She had been planning her exit for 2 years, starting the very month his hard work had finally begun to pay off. Idris gripped the wheel until his knuckles went pale. 2 years of birthdays. 2 years of Sunday dinners at his grandmother's table, Inaya passing the collard greens with a smile that he now understood had already been halfway out the door. 2 years of her sitting across from him at their own kitchen table, nodding along to his plans for the future, already knowing she wouldn't be standing in it. He called his grandmother. Anifa Harlan answered on the second ring, the way she always did, like she'd been expecting the call before it ever came through. Idris didn't say much. He didn't need to. "There's a plane waiting at O'Hare," Hanifa said, her voice steady and unhurried, the same voice she'd used to calm him down since he was 7 years old and scared of thunder. "But this decision belongs to you, Idris, not to me." He hung up, let the quiet settle over him for a moment, and his phone rang again almost immediately. Griffin Cole. His best friend since they were both 11 years old, running the same block on the south side, splitting the same dollar of lunch money on weeks when neither family had much extra to spare. "I know you just called your grandmother," Griffin said, his voice low and heavy in a way Idris had never once heard from him in 27 years of friendship. "And I know what Inaya's been planning. I've been helping you quietly protect part of your assets for almost 3 years now, handling things the way you asked me to. And I knew about her and Jet before you did. Months before. I tried to nudge you toward it a few times, hoping you'd notice on your own so I wouldn't have to say it. I told myself I didn't have real proof, just a feeling, and I didn't want to blow up your marriage over a feeling I couldn't be sure was even true. Turns out I should have trusted it. I should have just told you straight." Idris gripped the phone hard enough that his hand ached. Even Griffin. Even the one person he had trusted with everything had known, or at least suspected, and had chosen caution and doubt over telling him the truth. He didn't yell. He couldn't find the anger in him, not yet. He only asked, quietly, "How long, Griffin? All the way down to the truth. How long have you known?" Griffin's answer came slow and reluctant. "Almost 1.5 years." Idris ended the call without another word and sat with the silence of the car for a long while, watching his own breath fog faintly against the windshield. He kept digging after that, because some part of him needed the whole truth now, all at once. He found the paperwork itself, saved as a draft in an email folder he rarely checked. A divorce petition, prepared and signed 8 months earlier, sitting ready with Inaya's attorney, never yet filed with the Cook County Circuit Court. Inaya hadn't been planning to leave. She had already decided to leave, in writing, and was simply waiting until she and Jet had secured enough of the company's assets to walk away comfortable. Idris thought back over everything he'd given up without a single complaint. The Houston contract he'd turned down 3 years ago, worth more than he'd made in the 2 years before it combined, because Inaya cried at the kitchen table and said she didn't want to be far from her family. The overnight shifts he'd picked up quietly for 8 straight months to cover her mother's diabetes treatment. Treatment Inaya had told everyone, including her own mother, she was paying for herself. Every one of those sacrifices now sat in his memory like evidence in a case he hadn't known he was building. What Inaya had never known, because Idris had never seen a reason to mention it, was that a piece of Harlan Development Group had never belonged to the marriage at all. Years before he'd ever met her, Hanifa had quietly placed a founding stake in a family trust in his name, a quiet Harlan habit going back 3 generations, long before anybody's wedding day. Whatever Inaya walked away with in the divorce would come from what the two of them had built together during their 10 years as husband and wife. Substantial in its own right, and exactly what Jet's investors were counting on. But the peace Griffin was about to introduce to a ballroom full of strangers had never been hers to divide. One more discovery waited for him before the night was through. A message thread between Jet and a small group of outside investors, forwarded by mistake just weeks earlier to a shared company drive Idris still had access to. They were preparing to move on Harlan Development Group the moment the divorce was finalized, using whatever marital shares Anaya walked away with to force Idris out of the very company he'd built with his own two hands, starting from a single job site 15 years earlier. It wasn't just a broken marriage anymore. It was a plan, assembled carefully over years, to take everything Idris had spent his adult life constructing, his money, his company, and eventually, the story of who he was. Idris sat in that empty lot by the river until the sky over Lake Michigan began to lighten faintly at the edges. He wasn't angry anymore, not in the reckless way that makes a man do something he'll regret. What settled into him instead was something quieter and far more dangerous to the people who had underestimated him. Clarity. He knew exactly what Inaya and Jet had done. He knew exactly what neither of them realized he still had. And somewhere in that early morning stillness, a plan of his own quietly began to take shape. One that wouldn't need a single raised voice to work. Instead, he drove to his grandmother's house in Kenwood as the sun came up fully over the lake, sat at her kitchen table while she made 2 cups of coffee without being asked, and told her everything, start to finish, in a voice that never once rose above the sound of the percolator. Hanifa listened the whole way through without interrupting. When he finished, she only said, "Your granddaddy used to tell me, the loudest man in the room is rarely the most dangerous one in it." Idris held on to that the rest of the day. There was one gala left on the calendar that season, the biggest one of the year, the kind neither Inaya nor Jet would ever dare to miss. Idris picked up his phone one last time and sent a single text to Griffin. "I need you to introduce me at the gala Friday night." He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. What Inaya had built her entire plan around was a simple, dangerous assumption that the quiet man she'd married would stay quiet forever and never once notice what was slipping out from under him. Friday night, in front of everyone she'd spent years trying to impress, she was going to learn exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Griffin knew about the affair a year and a half before Idris did, and said nothing to protect the family's peace. Comment Team Griffin if you think loyalty sometimes means staying quiet. Comment Team Idris if silence like that is its own kind of betrayal. The Chicago Black Business Alliance held its annual gala at the Palmer House Hilton in the Loop, the kind of night where marble floors caught gold light off 3 enormous chandeliers, and everyone in the room had worked years to be standing exactly where they stood. 400 guests, old money and brand new money, trading business cards over champagne, under a ceiling painted with clouds that had watched over that ballroom since 1927. Inaya arrived on Jet's arm. She wore the same wine-red dress from that Tuesday night, and she wore it like a flag. Table after table, she introduced him with the same bright, certain voice. "This is Jet," she said, again and again, her hand resting on his forearm. "The real man in my life." Nobody at those tables knew yet that the man she'd left behind was already seated near the back of the room, in a simple black suit with no tie, a glass of water in front of him he hadn't touched, watching the evening unfold exactly the way he'd expected it would. Griffin Cole stepped up to the podium a little after 9 o'clock, and the room settled into the kind of hush a good speaker earns before he even opens his mouth. "Tonight," Griffin said, "I want to introduce someone most of you have done business with for years without ever knowing his name. A man who has quietly held 47% ownership in Harlan Development Group through a family trust established long before most of you signed your first contract with the company, before he was even a married man." A spotlight swept back across the ballroom and landed on Idris.
He stood slowly, buttoned his jacket, and walked to the stage the way he walked onto every job site he'd ever worked. Steady, unhurried, like a man who already knew exactly where his own 2 feet were carrying him. The room whispered as he passed between the tables. Inaya went very still in her seat, her champagne flute frozen halfway to her lips. Idris took the microphone and let the silence sit a beat before he spoke. "My name is Idris Harlan," he said. "For the past 3 years, I've quietly funded scholarships for 187 black students across Chicago public schools. I never put my name on a single one of those checks, because that was never the point of doing it." A ripple of applause started, warm and genuine. And near the third table from the stage, a young woman in a navy blazer rose halfway out of her seat, her hand pressed to her mouth. She had been one of those 187 students, now finishing her 2nd year at the University of Illinois. And until that exact moment, she had never known the name of the man who'd made it possible. Idris caught her eye for half a second, gave the smallest nod, and let the applause settle before he went on. "I've also spent the past 2 years quietly paying for my mother-in-law's diabetes treatment," he said, and his eyes moved, calm and direct, toward Inaya's table. "I paid her younger brother's college tuition in full, and for 2 of those years, I covered the resign for the Langston family, during a stretch when they were struggling more than most people in this room ever knew. Nobody asked me to keep any of that secret. I just never saw the need to announce it." Inaya's face drained of color. Beside her, Jet turned to look at her, confusion breaking hard across his features. She had never once told him where that rent money came from. She had let him believe it came from somewhere else entirely, or from nowhere at all, as long as he never asked too many questions about it. Idris wasn't finished. "There's one more thing I think this room should hear," he said, and lifted his phone, holding it close enough to the microphone that the recording carried clean across the ballroom. Inaya's own voice filled the room a moment later, calm and certain, recorded to her mother almost 2 years earlier. "Idris is finally building something real. Once it's big enough, I'm leaving. I can't spend my whole life with a man who only knows how to work." 400 people went completely silent. Then, at the edges of the room, the whispering began. Hands lifting to cover mouths, eyebrows climbing, a few guests at the closest tables simply staring at Inaya with open, unguarded disbelief. Inaya hadn't built this exit out of cruelty. She'd built it out of an old, private fear that had nothing to do with Idris at all. The fear of ending up like her own mother, dependent and overlooked, waiting on a man who never quite arrived. What she actually wanted wasn't Jet. It was proof that she would never again be the woman standing in someone else's shadow. The tragedy was that chasing that proof had turned her into exactly the kind of person she'd always been afraid of becoming. Jet leaned toward her, his voice low, but not nearly low enough. "You've been paying my family's rent this whole time? Why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" Inaya didn't answer him. She couldn't. Her carefully built evening was coming apart in real time, in front of every single person whose respect she had spent years cultivating. One dinner party and one donation at a time. She stood up fast enough that her chair scraped hard against the marble floor. "Idris, don't do this," she said, her voice climbing, losing all the polish it had carried through the entire evening. "Everything you have because I stood beside you through the hard years."
Idris looked at her from the stage, steady, without a single trace of anger in his voice.
"Do you remember 3 years ago, when your mother needed surgery, and you told everyone, including me, that you had it handled?"
He said.
"You never once asked me where that $40,000 payment actually came from. I did ask myself that question plenty of times, but you never did. Some part of you already knew you wouldn't like the answer."
Inaya opened her mouth and found nothing left inside it. Jet was staring at her now, not with affection, but with the particular suspicion of a man realizing he might be standing beside someone he never actually knew at all.
Then Jet made his own mistake, whispering to her in a voice that carried further than he intended. "Did you reach out to those outside investors without telling me first?" A few heads at the nearest tables turned sharply toward them. Inaya's eyes went wide with panic. That was the second secret to come apart in front of the room in under 5 minutes, and there was no version of this evening left worth salvaging. Griffin, who had stepped back near the edge of the stage but hadn't yet returned to his seat, watched it all unfold with the tired, steady look of a man who had carried a secret for a year and a half and was finally allowed to set it down. He caught Idris's eye once, a small nod passing between them, an apology and a thank you both at once that didn't need a single word. Somewhere near the bar, a table of investors Idris recognized from a dozen closed-door meetings over the years had gone quiet mid-conversation, watching Jet with a new and unflattering kind of attention. Whatever deal Jet had been quietly assembling with outside money, it wasn't going to survive the walk back to the parking garage. A man doesn't get to keep partners who just watched him lie badly in front of 400 witnesses. Idris set the microphone gently back on its stand, the small click of it landing louder than it should have in the ringing silence of the ballroom. He looked at Inaya one last time, not with rage, not even with sadness, but with something that looked almost like peace. "You won," he said quietly. "You always thought this was a game you needed to win, but I stopped playing it a long time ago." He stepped down off the stage and walked straight through the ballroom toward the exit, past 400 guests who parted for him without a word, past Griffin, who gave him a single, small nod of respect, past Inaya's table, where she stood frozen, one hand pressed flat against her chest, as though she could hold her own composure in place by force. Behind him, the whispering had already turned into something else entirely. The low, unmistakable sound of a reputation carefully built over years, unraveling in real time in front of the exact people it had been built for. The doorman at the Palmer house held the heavy brass and glass door open without a word, the way doormen do when they can sense a night has just turned into something people will talk about for years. Cold October air met Idris on the sidewalk of Monroe Street, sharp enough to clear his head, and for the first time since he'd walked into his own living room 3 days earlier, he breathed easy. Idris didn't look back once. He had one more stop to make that night, and it was already waiting for him out at O'Hare. Idris drove the 15 minutes out to O'Hare with the windows cracked, letting the cold air do the work his mind had been trying to do all night. Chicago slid past him in streetlight and silence, the skyline shrinking in his rearview mirror, then the flat stretch of expressway that always felt at that hour like driving off the edge of the city entirely. At the private aviation terminal, a Gulfstream G650 sat waiting on the tarmac, its white fuselage catching the runway lights, the Harlan family crest painted small and dignified near the tail. The cabin door stood open. Warm light spilled out onto the wet pavement below the stairs. Hanifa Harlan stood at the top of those stairs in a deep purple caftan, one hand resting on the cane she'd carried every day since her hip surgery 6 years earlier, though everyone in the family knew she barely needed it anymore. She watched Idris's car pull up with an expression that wasn't anger. It was something closer to patience, the particular patience of a woman who had been waiting a very long time for this exact night to arrive. Idris climbed out of the car and walked toward the stairs slowly, in no hurry now that the hardest part of the night was already behind him. Hanifa came down 2 steps to meet him halfway, close enough that only he could hear her. "Griffin called me the morning you asked him to introduce you," she admitted, a small, private smile pulling at the corner of her mouth. "Had a livestream link in my email within the hour. I've been sitting in that terminal lounge all evening with my tablet, watching every minute of it." "And?" Idris asked. And I'm glad I came dressed for standing on tarmac instead of sitting through another gala, Hanifa said, gesturing at the plain travel coat she wore over her kaftan. Her eyes were bright, but her voice stayed level, the same steady voice that had talked him through every hard year of his life without once raising in volume. Your mother would have been proud of how you handled that room tonight. Not because you humiliated anybody, because you didn't need to raise your voice to be heard. Idris had barely absorbed that when he heard heels striking pavement behind him, fast and uneven. Inaya. She'd left the Palmer house only minutes behind him, and she'd known exactly which terminal to head for. Signature Flight Support was the same private aviation building the Harlan family had used for a decade of holiday trips, and she'd pushed her car hard down the Kennedy Expressway to catch him before the wheels left the ground. She was still in the wine-red dress, her hair coming loose from its careful pins, mascara smudged in 2 dark lines beneath her eyes. Jet trailed several steps behind her, hands in his pockets, not daring to come any closer. Hanifa looked past Idris, directly at Inaya, and spoke in a voice clear enough to carry across the tarmac. Inaya, you divorced my grandson because you thought he was still poor. Look now. Really look. This is the family you just walked away from. Inaya's whole body seemed to shrink under that sentence. She looked at the jet, then at Idris, then back at Hanifa, and for the first time all night, Idris saw something in her face he hadn't seen in years. Real fear. Hanifa turned back to Idris. Do you want to get on this plane? Idris allowed himself the smallest smile. I'm getting on, he said. But I want you to know something first, Grandma. This jet wasn't sent here to rescue me. It's a test. You wanted to see whether I'd defend the Harlan name in public, in front of everybody, or whether I'd stay quiet and let it slide the way I usually do. Hanifa studied her grandson for a long moment, the runway lights catching the silver in her hair. And then she nodded slowly, the way a teacher nods at a student who has finally arrived at the right answer on his own. You really are my grandson, she said. That was when Inaya rushed forward and caught Idris's hand in both of hers. Her voice broke on the first word. Idris, I'm so sorry. I'm pregnant. It's Jet's. But I still love you. Please, we can start over. I'll change, I swear I will. Idris looked down at her hands wrapped around his, and then at her face, streaked and desperate under the tarmac lights. He felt no anger rise up in him. No pity either. Only a tiredness that had been building for months, finally settling somewhere he could set it down for good. He gently pulled his hand free. You don't have to keep lying to me anymore, Inaya, he said quietly. You already won, back at that gala. I hope it was everything you wanted. But I told you then, and I'm telling you now. I stopped playing this game a long time ago. Some part of Idris still loved the woman standing in front of him, that much was true, and he didn't pretend otherwise. But in the 3 days since she'd called him boring in his own living room, he'd learned something he couldn't unlearn. Love without honesty is just a slower way of losing yourself. He wasn't refusing her out of anger or revenge. He was refusing her because going back now would mean giving up everything he'd just relearned about his own worth. Inaya stood there frozen, as though the words had physically knocked the air out of her. Idris, please, she tried again, her voice cracking further. 10 years. Doesn't 10 years mean anything to you? It means everything to me, Idris said, and for the first time that night, something almost gentle crept into his voice. That's exactly why I'm not going to spend the next 10 pretending I didn't hear that recording, or see those bank transfers, or read what you told your mother 2 years ago. I loved you enough to give you the truth instead of a performance. I'd hope, somewhere in you, you'd want the same thing back." Jet finally spoke, quiet and useless, from several feet away. "Inaya, maybe we should just go." She didn't even turn to look at him. Behind her, Jet turned his own face away instead, unable to meet anyone's eyes, understanding without needing to be told that he'd just watched her lose the last real chance she had to fix any of this, and that whatever future the two of them had been building together had likely gone down with it. Idris climbed the stairs without another word. At the top, Hanifa touched his shoulder once, briefly, the way she had every night of his childhood before bed. Then she turned and disappeared into the cabin ahead of him. Idris paused in the doorway and looked back one final time. Inaya still stood on the tarmac below, alone under the harsh airport floodlights, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. Jet had drifted several feet away from her, already checking his phone, already halfway toward whatever came next for him, and nowhere near her side. For the first time since Idris had known her, Inaya looked small. The cabin door swung shut with a heavy, final sound. Not loud, but absolute. The kind of sound a chapter makes when it closes for good. Through the small oval window, as the jet began its slow taxi toward the runway, Idris watched the terminal lights shrink and blur. Somewhere down there, under one of them, Inaya was still standing exactly where he'd left her. He settled back into the leather seat across from his grandmother, who was already pouring 2 small glasses of sweet tea from a thermos she never traveled without, gala or no gala. "You did the hard part already," Hanifa said, handing him a glass. "Everything from here forward is just living." Idris looked out the window one more time as the runway lights began to blur into streaks beneath the wing. Chicago spreading out gold and endless below them. The lake a dark, quiet line at the edge of it all. He thought about the version of himself who had climbed his own porch steps 3 nights ago, tired and covered in concrete dust, believing his whole life was still exactly where he'd left it that morning. That man was gone now. In his place sat someone lighter. Someone who had just watched the last piece of an old life fall away, without needing to raise his voice even once. "You know," Hanifa said, settling into the seat across from him as the wheels left the tarmac, "your grandfather always used to say a man reveals his whole character in the 5 minutes right after he's been wronged. Not before. Not after he's had time to plan a speech. Right in that first 5 minutes, before he knows anyone's watching." Idris turned that over for a moment. "And how'd I do?" "You didn't raise your voice once tonight," Hanifa said. "Not in that ballroom, not on this tarmac. That's not something I taught you how to do, Idris. That's something you already had in you." She reached over and patted his hand once. The same brisk, business-like gesture of affection she'd been giving him since he was a boy too proud to be hugged in public. "Get some rest now. Tomorrow, there's a lot of decisions waiting on you, and none of them are going to be easy ones." The jet lifted off into the dark, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Idris Harlan closed his eyes and simply let himself rest. 3 months later, Idris officially took over full control of Harlan Development Group. The paperwork was simple, in the end, once the divorce settlement stopped being a fight and became just a formality. Inaya's attorneys had quietly stopped pushing for more the moment the gala recording made its way, uninvited, onto a local news segment. But Idris didn't move back into the house in Bronzeville. He didn't want the mirror in that hallway, or the porch light that used to burn gold for a woman who'd already stopped waiting up for him long before he ever noticed. Instead, he bought a modest brick 2-flat on the south side,
not far from the very job site in the loop where he'd once worked 14-hour days pouring foundations for buildings he'd never live in.
He sat down with his lawyers and his grandmother on a gray Tuesday afternoon and announced his final decision, one he'd been quietly working toward since the night of the gala. Nearly all of his controlling shares and personal assets would be transferred into a new organization, the Harlan Community Legacy Fund, a nonprofit built to support young Black entrepreneurs starting out in Southside neighborhoods like Woodlawn, Inglewood, and his own childhood streets in Bronzeville. The fund would run independently, with its own board, answering to no single family name. Idris would keep only enough to live comfortably and keep working, nothing more. Hanifa sat quietly through the entire announcement, her hands folded in her lap, her cane leaning against the arm of her chair. When Idris finished, she didn't speak right away. "When did you decide this?" she finally asked. "The night I found out about the divorce filing," Idris said. "I realized I didn't need to hold on to everything they thought I'd built for them. I only needed to hold on to what actually made me who I am." Hanifa rose slowly from her chair, walked over, and placed one hand on his shoulder. "Your mother used to tell me, 'Don't let money ruin my son. Let it make him stronger instead.'" Her voice caught, just slightly, on the word stronger. "You did exactly that, Idris. You turned out stronger than the money ever was." Inaya tried reaching him several times over those 3 months, a text here, a voicemail there, each one a little more desperate than the last. Idris never responded to a single one. There was nothing left unsaid between them that hadn't already been said in front of 400 witnesses at the Palmer house. Griffin showed up at the new Southside house the week after the announcement, standing on the front step with his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets, looking like a man who'd rehearsed his apology the whole drive over and forgotten most of it anyway. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "I let keeping the peace turn into something a lot closer to lying, and I know that." Idris let him stand there a moment before he stepped back and held the door open. "You protected my money for 3 years without taking a dollar for yourself," Idris said. "That counts for something. Come on in, Griffin. I'll put the coffee on." It wasn't forgiveness delivered all at once, the way it might happen in a movie. It was the slower, more honest kind. The kind that gets rebuilt one Tuesday coffee at a time. Jet fared worse. Federal investigators, following threads that had started unraveling the night the outside investor scheme came apart in public, eventually charged him with securities fraud and conspiracy to seize control of a private company under false pretenses. His name showed up in the Chicago Tribune's business section 3 separate times that autumn, each headline a little smaller than the last, the way a man's relevance tends to shrink once the scheme behind it collapses. One evening in late November, Idris stood alone on the rooftop deck of the new Harlan Development Group offices in the Loop, looking out over a city he'd spent his whole life either building or watching get built. The lake stretched dark and endless to the east. Street lights strung themselves out in every direction below him, a whole grid of ordinary lives moving through ordinary evenings, the way his own life had moved for 38 years before any of this happened. He thought back over everything. The years of quiet sacrifice nobody had noticed. The recording he'd carried in his pocket for 2 days before he ever played it out loud. The moment Inaya's face had gone pale under the ballroom lights. The tarmac at O'Hare glowing under floodlights while she stood there alone. He waited for the anger to come, the way it sometimes still did late at night. It didn't come this time. What came instead was something lighter, something closer to peace than he'd felt in longer than he could remember. He wasn't the same man who had climbed his own porch steps 3 months earlier, tired and covered in concrete dust, still believing his whole life was exactly where he'd left it that morning. That man had lost almost everything he thought defined him in the span of one single week. A marriage, a friend's easy trust, the comfortable assumption that loyalty runs in both directions simply because you've given it freely for 10 years. But somewhere in that same week, Idris had also found something he hadn't known he was missing. The plain, quiet relief of no longer needing anyone else's permission to know his own worth. He didn't need Inaya's love to prove he was worth loving. He didn't need Jet's respect to know what he'd built was real. He didn't even need his grandmother's approval, though he was grateful, always, to have it. He had only ever needed to keep being exactly who he already was. Down below, the city kept moving, the way cities do, indifferent to any one person's private reckoning. Idris pulled his jacket tighter against the November wind, took one more long look at the skyline he'd helped raise floor by floor, and turned back toward the elevator, ready for whatever the fund's first real project would require of him in the morning. These days, Idris spends most of his mornings in a small office on the ground floor of his Southside 2-flat, the modest headquarters of the Harlan Community Legacy Fund. There's no marble here, no chandeliers, no gilded mirrors. There's a second-hand desk, a coffee maker that takes its time, and a corkboard slowly filling up with photographs of young business owners the fund has helped get off the ground. A bakery on 63rd Street, a small construction outfit run by two brothers barely out of their 20s, a bookstore that had been boarded up for 6 years before somebody finally believed it was worth reopening. On his desk sits an old photograph, one he hasn't been able to throw away, though he's tried twice. It shows Idris and Inaya 5 years back, standing in front of their very first apartment in Bronzeville. Both of them younger, both of them laughing at something the camera never caught. He looks at it for a long moment most mornings. Today, he reaches over and gently sets it face down, not out of anger, out of the simple, practical understanding that some chapters are meant to be closed quietly, without ceremony, the same way you'd turn off a lamp in a room you're finished sitting in. He steps out onto the front porch as the Chicago sky starts turning that particular shade of orange it only wears in early evening, the kind of light that makes even a plain brick street on the south side look like something worth painting. Next door, on a porch that's seen better decades, 3 young men sit close together, hunched over a laptop, arguing good-naturedly about a business plan for a mobile detailing service. One of them, no older than 23, glances over, recognizes Idris, and gives him a small, respectful nod. Idris nods back. He doesn't need to say much these days. He's learned that showing up, quietly and consistently, says more than most speeches ever could. Later that evening, his grandmother calls, the way she does most Sundays now, usually right around the time she's pulling a sweet potato pie out of the oven for the church potluck the next morning. She complains, as always, about her old vacuum cleaner, the one his nephew has taken to calling the old dragon on account of the noise it makes climbing the stairs, and Idris laughs harder than the joke probably deserves, mostly because it's good, plain, ordinary laughter, the kind he'd nearly forgotten how much he missed. Inside him, there's no leftover anger, no ache from being betrayed by people who ate dinner at his table, no hunger left for anyone's applause or apology. What used to sit in his chest like a stone has settled, slowly, into something closer to stillness. He won in the end. Not by ruining Inaya or Jet in front of the world, though he could have gone further than he did, and everybody in that ballroom would have understood if he had. He won by walking away from the very things they assumed he'd fight hardest to keep, and using what was left to build something bigger than any one man's pride. Idris looks out at the street a while longer, at porch lights flickering on one by one down the block, at a city that has never once stopped moving for anybody's heartbreak. He thinks about all of it one more time. The wine-red dress in the hallway mirror, the recording he carried in his pocket for 2 days before playing it, the tarmac lights at O'Hare, his grandmother's hand on his shoulder. Then, quiet enough that only he can hear it, he says to himself, "Silence isn't weakness. It's how a strong man chooses to win in his own way." And sometimes, real victory isn't about holding on to everything. It's about knowing exactly when to let go. He turns and steps back inside,
closing the door gently behind him. Warm light spills out through the front window and onto the porch behind him. Out on the street, Chicago keeps moving the way it always has, but Idris isn't being carried along by it anymore. For the first time in years, he's the one choosing the direction. This story reminds us that dignity was never about staying silent forever. It's about knowing exactly when your silence has finished its work and when it's time to speak. If you're widowed, or if a marriage of decades ended in a way you never chose, here's something more useful than being told to stay strong. Tonight, before you turn off the kitchen light, pull out whatever notebook is closest, even the spiral one from the drugstore, and write down one thing you did right this week. Just one. Do that every night for a month before you decide what the rest of your life is worth. If Sunday afternoons have gone quiet, call the grandchild who still picks up on the second ring and ask them to come learn the one recipe nobody else in the family has bothered to write down. Let them get flour on the counter. Let them keep the card afterward. And if you're the one who already suspects someone in your life isn't telling you everything, don't wait for a gala or a jet on a runway to find out. Start a plain folder. Write down dates and amounts as you notice them. Call your own attorney before you sign anything, not after. Real strength was never about carrying a hard season alone forever. It was always about knowing which ordinary evening to finally set the weight down, and who's still standing close enough to help you carry what's left. These scripts are born from genuine human creativity and a desire to confront social truths. AI acted as a co-pilot, helping organize thoughts so that powerful messages of fairness, forgiveness, and human potential could touch hearts worldwide. Production team: Story and Screenplay by Quinn Fung. Character development and visual conceptualization by Chris Nguyen. Video scripting and scene adaptation by David Nguyen. A passionate team dedicated to bringing this story to life.